Welcome to What's Your Signal, the podcast exploring enterprise networking trends and the secure connectivity that underlies it all. You're joined by me, Taylor Walker, and my co-host, Mauricio Steffen. How's it going, Mauricio?
Good. How's it hanging, Taylor?
Good. So, Mauricio, how often do you use elevators?
Every time I come into the office.
So, you are an elevator enthusiast, just like me.
I find that the elevators really lift me up.
Wow. Okay. Well, I think that you'll find this stat interesting. So, according to Google AI, a well-maintained elevator typically experiences between 0.5 and 2 breakdowns per year, with 20% of those being severe, such as trapping someone inside.
Well, thanks for that. That's a new nightmare for me. But that's not a lot of downtime. But you really don't want to be part of that 20%.
Oh, for sure, which is why emergency call systems and elevators are so important. And do you know how those services are usually connected?
Yeah, they're typically connected through, old school landlines or, what's called plain old telephone service or POTS for short.
Right, but it's interesting because POTS lines are aging out. They're yesterday's news, and now a bunch of different services that rely on POTS lines need a new type of connectivity that can be easily integrated into existing infrastructure. Today we've got Reed Perryman with us. He's the VP of Sales for RCN Technologies, and he's pretty fired up about the value of cellular-based solutions for replacing POTS lines in many very important everyday scenarios. So let's jump in. So Reed, welcome. We are excited to chat with you today. So first things first, a lot of the folks listening might not be super aware of the extent to which POTS lines, plain old telephone service lines, support everyday services in our world. So can you kind of give us a bit of a history lesson about POTS?
Yeah, sure, Taylor. I really appreciate that question and this opportunity, by the way. So POTS lines, if we're going to do this justice, we've got to dial it all the way back to 1876. It's actually the invention of a very minor invention that definitely didn't change the world called the telephone. Right? Alexander Graham Bell, he invents the telephone and makes the very first voice call. And from that point onward, it really revolutionized the way humans communicate with each other. So that being said, standard POTS line is a copper wire line that's typically strung on telephone poles, so therefore telephone lines, right? But since there are not so many telephone lines anymore because we all have cell phones, that's really transitioned into just what we call plain old telephony service lines, POTS lines, analog copper lines. They go by many names. But a bit of a state of the union. The FCC predicts there's about 36 million POTS lines still in America today. And they actually, I did some research on this. It looks like they're dwindling at maybe about 1 million a year. Some are just being terminated, others are not. But what's really interesting, Taylor, and kind of the big why behind this conversation is that POTS lines, they support voice lines, fire lines, elevator phone lines, emergency phone lines, and other mission critical applications. In August, the FCC decided, hey, you know what? Local exchange carriers, we don't require you to support these things anymore. So it left the decision to every single major telco carrier in the US. Do we want to support it? Do we want to terminate the lines? And what are the consequences if we terminate the lines? I don't know, say by the end of the year. So what we've seen is really this wild west of some are saying, okay, our least profitable areas for these networks, just kill them. We're off these things. We're going to send out a termination notice. You've got 90 days. Others have said, hey, we're going to give you a 3-year commitment because we value your business. While others, I was just reading a USA Today article, I won't name any names, but one that is very big and very blue in its primary color. They are one of the biggest providers of POTS lines, and they just went on record saying, into 2029, we're out. You've got to figure this out. It's really expensive to maintain copper networks and it's old technology. So that's a bit of the state of the union today and what business customers that subscribe to POTS lines can expect. They're going to go away. Every telco agrees on that.
So when they're, when somebody like, the Globe, it says that they're pulling out, like, who are they putting that responsibility back on then? So like for fire alarms and stuff, does that just go back to like the cities that they're in? And then is it cities that are trying to find alternatives, or like who's stuck?
It's left to the customer. So whoever's the subscriber to that POTS line, they have to figure something out, because the telcos are saying, hey, we're going to drop dead by this date. And to check our liability boxes, all we really have to do is make sure that we are in good standing on our contract or serving out our contracts, or we just have to give you a notice with sufficient time to find a replacement. So it's really this disproportionate burden on IT leaders, both in the government space, the small business space, and the enterprise space, that traditionally have never had to think of these things beyond, I call my big telco locally, they get me what I need, and they provide end-to-end service from order to technician coming out and hooking up and verifying. From there, it's up to my contracted vendors for my fire alarms or burglar alarms or elevators to make sure the equipment works. So it's a huge burden for a lot of people.
Now, Reed, you mentioned that the regulation to support these things ceased in 2021. I understood, like, especially when it came to like elevator call boxes and fire alarm panels and those kind of things, like the connection was mandatory through regulation. Now, are you saying those regulations went away, or did they change that they no longer require POTS lines? They just require some sort of connectivity for those lifelines?
Yeah, Mauricio, that's a really, really good question. And it's not only a matter of what we'll call fire compliancy or security compliancies. Those are the big two that people think of. So you've got the NFPA. This is this governing regulatory body that presides over really the standards for fire prevention and suppression, not only as it comes to telecommunications, but also when it comes to building codes and standards in general, down to material level, right? But they're out there and they're saying this has to be true. And the burglary security people are saying this has to be true. And then you have this whole other host of people saying this has to be true. But at the end of the day, they all are at the mercy of these telco carriers, because the telco carriers hold the power. We take it away, you have to have an alternative option. So luckily, some of these governing regulatory bodies, NFPA, for example, says, hey, as long as you check these boxes, you can provide a materially different solution from a telco perspective to a traditional analog copper POTS line, and we'll verify it. Your local fire marshal, wherever your jurisdiction and authority, will check that box. Now, we could go into a bag of weeds on what that looks like, but that leniency has allowed cellular to really leap into the limelight for cost-effective POTS replacements, while also enhancing that value proposition to the customer from a support and management perspective.
Reed, you talked about some of the challenges that were associated with POT lines. So, the cost is one. They're expensive to maintain and regulate, and subscription costs will, surely go up as people switch to digital communications. And you talked about kind of the role of the FCC in this phasing out. So folks are kind of forced to switch. What are some of the other challenges that are associated with POTS lines?
Yeah, there's a lot. And so first I want to benchmark cost, right? Because analog copper POTS lines have traditionally been very cheap out there. They've been $20 a month, right? And that's more on the expensive end. So what we've seen since the FCC's deregulation of support, because telcos aren't required, because copper networks, they're old, sometimes over 100 years old in certain cases, because they've degraded, because the cost of copper has gone up here in recent years, which has led to increased theft. In certain markets, such as California, we've spoken to customers that are being charged in surplus of $1,400 a month for a single line. I just talked to a huge cinema company, right? The movies, cinema company that said, hey, we have an LA location and it's got over 30 lines, $1,400 a month per line. It's absolutely bonkers, right? So in addition to cost, which is variable depending on what their LEC is doing, you've also got management. Again, I'll go back to some of these networks are 100 years. The building I'm here at RCN, luckily no POTS lines, but it was built at the beginning of the 21st century, around 1905. If your network is that old and you've had multiple tenants through the years, and worse, it's a large building that you subdivided and subdivided and subdivided, your copper network is probably doomsday. When you walk into that DMARC room, you probably have a spider's nest of wires and you have no idea what is what, because these telcos have managed it for you. And it's like insider trading knowledge. They're the expert. You've never had to go down in that dungeon and face the wolf spiders, right? They've done it for you. So a lot of people are inheriting this problem and they don't even know where to start with the problem. Other than that, what I'll say is that most traditional copper analog lines, there's no monitoring function or capability. You always trust that it's up. So let's say the fire marshal is coming to Ericsson Enterprise Wireless HQ's nice new building there in downtown Boise. And they go to the elevator and everybody expects that elevator phone's functioning because no one's had to use it. That's a good thing, but the fire marshal hits it and there's no communication. Turns out it's been down for months or whoever knows how long. Huge liability for that property management company. And also huge fine for that property management company. You can't monitor these things. So traditionally you've had to roll a truck. And if you had a more blasé attitude towards it, then you just didn't know. You didn't know what you didn't know and you hope for the best, right? So there's a lot of other challenges, mainly around liability, inflating costs, and overall management and approach to replacement that people have to consider. On top of the fact that a lot of the telcos, you can't order new lines and maintenance is pretty bad at this point. They're not giving you stellar SLAs to go fix your POTS lines if they're broken.
So I'm curious, what is RCN doing to kind of help in these situations, and now that folks are starting to replace POTS lines?
So the number one thing, Taylor, is that we offer a solution, and it's a solution that is meant to convert these analog signals that are traditionally riding analog POTS lines over to a digital IP addressable solution, still maintain that packet or communication syntax integrity, and shoot it to its endpoint destination, whether that's your fire monitoring control center or whether that is your security control center, wherever it needs to go, right? So RCN is actually, we've developed a solution. I actually have it here. It's called POTS Link. Let me scoot back. So just people that see this can get an idea of, it's not an intrusive device, but what it is, what it does effectively is it harnesses a Cradlepoint router, Ericsson Cradlepoint router, as an LTE communication gateway to give a WAN source out to the internet and endpoint destination. We use a voice over IP technology as well that RCN provides, and we have an analog to digital converter in there. So we are able to take these tones and whatever communication sequence, there's a lot of them, we could go down a rabbit hole, we're able to make that IP addressable and send that over a SIP trunk via an LTE network provided by one of the major carriers, whether that's Verizon, AT&T, or T-Mobile. So effectively for the customer, we take their line out of what's called a 66 block and we punch it into our device. And as long as we've done the port on that number correctly, or if they don't need their same number, give them a new number, and we've got cell signal, we're off to the races. We've replaced their POTS line.
What are some of the advantages that your customers are seeing who have done this replacement so far?
Yeah, a couple of advantages. Well, first and foremost, I mentioned that a lot of these IT folks have never had to think about POTS lines. So when you think about the prospect of going into the dungeon and facing the spiders and trying to figure out what you have, what's actually functionally useful right now, I'll give you an example. There was a customer, it's actually the world's busiest airport here in America, and we had to go do copper POTS line replacement in their e-terminal. And for whatever reason, a lot of the gate agent phones were still on copper. There were unique infrastructure challenges. They couldn't trench out broadband to this terminal. So we had to go in to this communications room. So imagine walking into this room. There's 200 Old school telephony, 66 block racks with POTS lines plugged in. And we're looking for 80 that are currently powering these phones. And the labeling on these things is the Wild West. So first and foremost, I tell you that story because customers get organization, they get inventory, they get a blueprint, and they understand what they have and what they don't have. And often, Taylor, we see customers that are being billed for POTS lines that haven't been connected to anything in a very long time. So almost always there's instantaneous cost savings. The second thing we do, and this is really good if they want to do, let's say, failover with an Ericsson Cradlepoint device as well, or maybe a fixed wireless primary with something like the E300. So what we do there is we give them an RF viability survey at that installation point. Cellular solution have to have signal. So we show them how viable T-Mobile, Verizon, AT&T is right there in the DMARC room. And if not, we propose a pathway with an external antenna, et cetera, to viability. So we're able to actually consult them on tertiary WAN connections for their primary network as well. When we get it installed, it's fully monitored, it's fully managed, no more guessing if it's up or it's down, and we provide full support on this as well. So there's a host of different benefits. I think most people don't realize how important that first one is. You get stock and inventory of what's real, what's not, and where it is.
Reed, you mentioned right that the POTS lines sometimes had SLAs, and maybe or maybe not they were being achieved. I think everybody that's listening, all 5 people, are familiar that cellular is best effort, right? It hasn't come around to the SLAs that business is expecting. Now, you kind of mentioned that RCN is doing monitoring and management of this. Is that how you kind of overcome that challenge of cellular not having a dedicated SLA?
Yeah, so that's one way, Mauricio, that we're overcoming that. But we have to be really careful when it comes to life safety applications, specifically elevator, emergency phone, fire, burglar type solutions. And you actually look at the documentation, the verbiage, the legislation for NFPA, and they go, okay, if you're going to touch a fire panel, it can't be a best effort technology. In fact, we often need you to have 2 lines of communication. There can't be a single point of failure. You need power redundancy. And we would actually prefer you to have 2 different avenues of WAN communication, not just one wireless, not just one wireline. So what we often do to protect the integrity and overcome that best effort, we'll consult with customers and say, hey, if you want this to be as bulletproof as possible, we've got a couple of options for you. First and foremost, we're going to argue until the cows come home that you should be on cellular first, because any given truck could run into any given pole connected to any given building that you own with POTS lines, totally take down your broadband. Cellular is almost always up. I ask people all the time, when's the last time you experienced a network outage on your phone? I'll tell you, I've been on Verizon for 20 years, one time. Now, God bless me, one time, right? But only one time in 20 years I've ever been without Verizon cell phone service, and there's been a major network outage. So that's one. 2, Cradlepoints have a secondary SIM slot. So we can actually not only give the customer a primary SIM on the strongest available carrier, but we can give them a backup SIM on the second available carrier. We're actually starting to integrate smart SIM solutions that have carrier switching capabilities, meaning we have even more resiliency built in to the product. And then finally, we'll recommend, especially for life safety, let's go ahead and integrate your WAN network into it as well, your wireline WAN network. Let's make sure, hey, we can run that primary hunky-dory, cellular can play backup, but we're going to give you 3 viable lanes of communication. And that's how we're going to holistically overcome that best effort. The rest, as far as cellular concern, is just making sure we get that RF fuel, that cellular fuel, to the router so it can actually produce the result for the customer.
Are you using satellite as a WAN link in any scenarios?
Yeah, I'm not opposed to it, actually. We have been exploring sat WAN, and I think that it's becoming increasingly viable with a lot of the players out there doing LEO and MEO. And I know that we have some here that we're testing right now in conjunction with some of our other solutions, but that would be just as viable, Taylor. And technically, at that point, you could give them a fourth lane if they had the
Yeah.
stomach for it or wanted it.
Yeah. I'm curious, I was thinking a while back towards the middle-ish of this conversation, what the learning curve looked like for companies. But the more I think about it, I'm thinking there really isn't much of one because they just went from not managing it, right? Because like the telcos were managing it to cellular mostly, which is typically a pretty easy system to adopt. But are there any other remarks you might have on like what that learning curve looks like for companies?
Yeah, I think that what you have is you typically have facilities has traditionally managed POTS lines. They're dumping this on IT's door because all of a sudden a router has to be involved and telephony has to be involved. Whoa, not a facilities thing anymore. It's not infrastructure. So you've got a lot of people that are just not used to it, and they approach it and they see the disorganization. They've never had to think about it. And there's that fear of the unknown, right? So that's very fraught for IT people. For facilities people or people that have always done it that might live in both lanes, facilities and IT, they have always been used to one thing. POTS are simple. They're an analog solution. They're a dummy solution. We don't need a complex solution. So the prospect of deploying a solution like POTS Link with a Cradlepoint router in it, scary because it's complex all of a sudden. So I've made a big argument with my team that we have to keep POTS simple, right? I love kind of the Steve Jobs mentality with the iPhone. When they launched the iPhone, they said, how can we remove the technology from technology? If you get what I mean there, right? And the original iPhone launched and it was a home button and an intuitive user interface. It was so simple to lean on a Geico statement. Even a caveman could do it, right? So that's what I always advocate with RCN sellers is, hey, keep it simple, right? There might be complexity. We might have to follow these regulatory bodies. We might have to deal with physics because that's the inherent nature of cellular. But to the customer, they just need to know that A, it's going to work the exact same way it used to work. B, it's going to be a reliable solution and even more reliable. 3, it's going to be affordable compared to a traditional POTS line. And 4, the value proposition is radically enhanced over traditional POTS because now you not only get monitoring, you get real-time alerts, and you get full-time support from the RCN team. So it's simple, but with that added value prop, again, if you make it complicated, we've seen people just lose their minds because they want it simple.
So besides who's managing what, are there other things that need to change during this transition from POTS to cellular? And I'm thinking like how emergency phones are tested and how do those changes impact the adoption or rollout? Like, are there companies that are maybe saying, well, we'd love to make this switch and we're being forced to, but we can't do it until so-and-so changes the way that they test it, and they can't change the way they test it until this. So are you running into any like this domino effect of things that need to change down the line to make the adoption successful?
In some cases, we are, Taylor. I think it's few and far between, actually. The majority of, let's say, ecosystem vendors that we do business with, because they're part of this too, right? Every single building is going to have some kind of contracted fire monitoring system. Everyone with a burglary might have a contracted burglary, so on and so forth, right? Everyone has been incredibly willing to work with us. Now, there's been some co-opetition out there, especially in the realm of fire. To be quite frank with you, there's not going to be anyone better than the fire monitoring companies to deal with those because they speak that language and very fluently as well. But there's not been a ton. And what I'll tell you is that we usually rely on what we call last mile copper infrastructure. So we don't rely of it outside the building, but your last mile twisted pair copper line from your traditional DMARC point, think of it like the proto network rack, all the way to your elevator or all the way to your fire alarm panel. We rely on that. So typically, all we're doing is switching the WAN source. And there's almost nothing from a WAN source perspective that we can't do. The last thing I'll say is that best practice with fire and sometimes burglary, we always ask customers, hey, if we're going to do that for you, we need your fire panel technician to be on site. We need your security panel technician to be on site. A, we don't want to gamble and create liability for you. B, they're fluent in that language of that panel. They can reprogram it to communicate with our solution. So it's more of a joint partnership. Like I said, mostly everybody's in because they know they want off copper.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we're pretty much out of time on this conversation, and we certainly know more about POTS lines than when we started, and probably more than a lot of folks now. So thanks so much for sharing your knowledge with us, Reed. We appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, guys. Really appreciate it. It was fun.
I love talking to Reed. He just makes he makes things very simple, easy to understand. And I liked this topic in particular because I worked at AT&T for a decade. I think I've told you this before. And I remember talking about POTS, and it's funny that we're still talking about it. Like when this topic came up, I was like, these are still being used. So it was good to get some clarification around that and kind of what the process is now.
Yeah, it is interesting to think about, right? It's like, how long has it been since you've had a landline at your house, right? And I'm not talking about the old school ones where you could plug it into a wall outlet or whatever, like the early stages of VoIP. And I can't remember some of the company names, but like they were pitching to replace landlines, and then cellular phones just became ubiquitous. Like everybody's got a cell phone. No one's got a landline anymore. And to think about how long ago that was is exactly it, because it's like I haven't had a landline in my home for probably more than 20 years at this point. But to think that there are still some life safety applications that do rely on that technology because, one, people are reluctant to change, but two, it is a tried and true technology that people don't necessarily want to risk people's lives on something new and untested. And I think at this point in time, right, the things that Reed is talking about is, one, cellular is no longer an untested technology. It is a fully tested that people rely on all the time, rely on their own safety on cellular, right? Because you don't have a landline, which means if you have to call 911 or 999 or whatever the number is in your country, you're relying on your cellular phone to do that, right? You've decided that your own family's life safety, cellular can rely on that. And so we're just extending that into applications that can now rely on that. And not only that, moving to this new type of technology like Reed outlined allows you to have more redundancy in that life safety application, right? Where it was a single or two copper lines is now multiple WAN links, not just relying on a single technology, but you could do cellular or broadband or satellite or any combination of the three to ensure that when it matters most, that connectivity is there.
Absolutely. Well, thank you all for listening. If you enjoyed this conversation about how cellular connectivity is helping companies replace POTS lines, please share it with a friend, then rate and subscribe to What's Your Signal wherever you listen to podcasts.